What's up, guys? Welcome back to gcnn.com. If you haven't visited the site before, this is going to be a brand new section added to the website in the upcoming weeks. It's called Amazing Coincidences, and this is where we're going to be looking at crimes that have a number of amazing coincidences surrounding them. These are coincidences that people like academics, scientists, non-conspiracy theorists tend to dismiss. They tend to dismiss these coincidences. But what I have found is that a number of these coincidences are too fantastic to dismiss. So for example, we have 9/11, obviously a great crime with a lot of conspiracies surrounding it. And if we look at some of the amazing coincidences surrounding that crime, just a few, you can see where these conspiracies come from. Now, the entire events surrounding 9/11 is something I'll have to cover in another video, because this is only going to be a short video today, just to give you a brief example of some of the amazing coincidences surrounding 9/11 that are maybe not so mainstream, and when they are heard about, they're dismissed as it's just a coincidence. Some of the conspiracies surrounding 9/11 say, the Bushes did it. The Bushes did it for oil. And they get simplified down into mainstream conspiracies. Now, the Bush family are a bloodline that connects back to the Merovingian bloodline, which is associated with the bloodline of Jesus, apparently. And this is why they hold that bloodline in such high regard. Now, if we look at 9/11, and some of the characters who were in charge during 9/11, some of the people's behavior that were involved with 9/11 who were in positions of power, this story takes on a whole new meaning. It looks very different, it looks very shady, and it looks like something that we might need to look at again. So let's look at, just 3 of the men that were in charge during 9/11. Like I said, I'll go into this in more detail in another video. This is just a general video for today. So let's look at, for example, we got Donald Rumsfeld, who was the defense secretary at the time. He was in charge. We got Bush, obviously, George Bush Jr., who was the president at the time of 9/11. And then we got his vice president, Dick Cheney, all in charge during 9/11. Now let's look at a few interesting connections that the public might not have seen when they say some of these people might have had something to do with the events surrounding 9/11. So the first interesting coincidence I got here is that, as far as I can tell from my research, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and President Bush and his father before that were all members of a secret society called Skull and Bones. Now, here's where the coincidences start to get a bit interesting. Donald Rumsfeld was classmates with James Baker. Now, James Baker was the vice president to George Bush Sr. during the Gulf War. And apparently, the Baker family has a long-standing relationship with Rockefeller Standard Oil. So you can see already, within a few sentences, you can see the same names that I talk about in my videos, that I write about in my articles. The same names are already popping up. So we've got the Bush bloodline, we've got Rockefeller Standard Oil, and we've got a bunch of front men in front of them that they control. Now, one of the men being controlled by these bloodline families that I talk about, such as the Bushes, was actually Donald Rumsfeld, the man I just mentioned. Now, it's important to get a bit of an idea of the type of man you're dealing with. You can judge a lot by people's behavior. So Donald Rumsfeld is the man who sold chemical weapons technology, including anthrax and the bubonic plague, to Saddam Hussein in 1983. And then in 2000, through his engineering company called ABB, he then distributed nuclear weapons to North Korea. Just to show you what kind of man you're dealing with, This is the man who condemned Saddam Hussein's behavior before selling chemical weapons to him in '83, and then condemned North Korea's behavior after he sold chemical weapons to them in the early 2000s. Now, Rumsfeld is also the man who got aspartame approved. So this is a sugar substitute, which is proven to be quite detrimental to health, actually, and he was the one that got that approved for that shit in soft drinks. And how did he do that? He got it approved through his Bush connections, the connections that he had in the Bush administration. He put people in power who supported his aspartame policies, and he removed those who did not. Now, Rumsfeld at the time, he worked for Cell Pharmaceuticals, and he used his contacts, like I said, in the Reagan Bush administrations to get permission for this aspartame to be used in drinks and food, despite, this is what is not talked about in the public, despite data which showed negative effects. And there's been a whole book now published by, I think his name is H.J. Roberts. The book is called Aspartame Disease, an Ignored Epidemic, and it's now talking about how, aspartame is having certain effects on people's bodies, maybe causing cancer, maybe doing things it shouldn't be doing to the body. And Rumsfeld was the man that got that shit approved. Now listen to this. Rumsfeld eventually sold his stock in aspartame. And who did he sell it to? Monsanto, which is run by Gates. Keep it in the family, you know what I mean? Now that might not be much of a coincidence to most, but if you watch my Bill Gates video on the website gcnn.com, you'll see a video there which is entitled Bill Gates and His Rise to Power in Global Health Governance. If you watch that video, you'll then understand exactly why that stock was sold to Gates, and it will give you a more detailed background on the Gates bloodline, which is actually connected to the Rockefeller family. So that's our first set of coincidences, but they don't seem that amazing yet, right? So let's keep going with this. Let's just have a look at a few more coincidences. Okay, so another classmate of Rumsfeld was Frank Carlucci. Now this guy was a former number 2 in the CIA. He was head of an organization called the Carlyle Group. He had close ties to the Bush family, and he was also thrown out of African countries for 2 assassination attempts. Interestingly enough, he was also the mentor of Colin Powell, who was also in charge during 9/11. Now the Carlyle Group is an organization that profits off war. So they make their profits by supplying armory, weapons, war supplies, stuff like that. Now, the 2 other members of the Carlyle Group, 2 other key members, just happened to be George Bush Sr. and James Baker, who was the vice president to George Bush Sr. I'm sure this is a very innocent coincidence, and there's nothing to worry about here at all. Just to show you a bit of their European influence, the head of the Carlyle Group at the time in Europe was John Major. So there you see massive political reach, influence there. Now, what is rarely talked about in the mainstream media about the Carlyle Group is that they had massive investments from and associations to the Bin Laden family. And there was a story that surfaced about how the Bin Laden family actually withdrew their investments in the Carlyle Group after it was exposed in the media. Now, interestingly, Bush Sr. was an advisor to the Saudi royal family and the Bin Laden family on behalf of the Carlyle Group. Bush Sr. also had another company at the time called Arbusto Energy. Now, this was funded into existence by members of the Skull and Bones Society, which I told you about earlier. It was ran by George Bush Sr. and later handed over to George Bush Jr. Now, a key investor of Arbusto Energy was Salem bin Laden, head of the Bin Laden Construction Group. So we're starting to see, again, more hidden, I guess you could call it, connections that you wouldn't usually see. They're beginning to surface. Now, if we look at some of the dealings between the Bin Laden family and the Bush family, it does look very shady. And I'm going to show you how. In 1996, the Khobar Tower bombing. This was the bombing of the US headquarters in Saudi Arabia. Now, at the time, the State Department in America openly, publicly, blamed Bin Laden for this attack. So just out of curiosity, who got the contracts to rebuild the damaged areas after the Khobar Tower bombing? Bin Laden Construction. Amazing coincidence, isn't it? How did this happen? Why is this not talked about in the mainstream media? The same thing happened during the Gulf War of 1991. Areas of Iraq were bombed. And guess who won the contracts to rebuild those areas? Dick Cheney. Also in charge at the time of 9/11. The coincidences just keep coming. By this point, there are a ridiculous number of coincidences starting to pile up. And here's another one. Much like the US State Department at the time blamed Bin Laden for the attacks on the Khobar Tower, the US had also at the time during 9/11 vowed war on Bin Laden. People like Bush's Dick Cheney vowed to get Bin Laden, crush him. Now, isn't it another coincidence that a document leaked by the FBI is called Case ID-199-1WF213589.199 was released by the program Newsnight in the early 2000s, and this document showed how the Bush family had done everything in their power to halt the investigations, basically, to stop any investigations around the Saudi royal family, around the Bin Laden family, halt them. CIA officers were actually told, back off. Now, this is the kind of influence I'm talking about coming from the Bush bloodline, which is, again, another factor that is overlooked. Something else that's overlooked, I feel, is how people such as George Bush Sr. acquire this power to where they're able to exert such influence. And I think something that's overlooked is maybe the fact that he was the head of the CIA for 20 years. Deeply, deeply connected. You don't lose these connections just because you step away from the game or you step down as the head of the CIA. And Bush was one that remained deeply connected. Now, the Bush family have a long history of, shall we say, funding the enemy. This has been going on way back to World War II through Prescott Bush, the dad of the Bushes, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Prescott Bush was a member of Skull and Bones, one of the early members, showing that this family has a long history connected with the secret society called Skull and Bones. And what they would do, from what I can see, is they would funnel money into companies, projects, and they will be playing a part in basically manipulating both sides of the war. So they'll give one side the weapons it needs, they give the other side the money it needs to start that war off and get them to play both sides against each other. And they do that by funding through companies. And I think Prescott Bush was the first one I saw that was really influential in doing this, when he actually had two companies shut down during war times for trading with the Nazis. And if you look at where, for example, the Nazis were funded from, they were funded from Wall Street in London. If you look at some of the names associated with the funding of the Nazi Party, you'll find the Bush's name there through the Union Banking Corporation, which Prescott Bush ran. And he had connections to the Harriman brothers. They married into the Churchill family. They had connections to the Rockefeller family. You see what I'm saying? There's a lot of the same names popping up. Documents show that large amounts of money were funneled out of America into these German companies by bloodline families such as the Harriman brothers, the Rockefellers, the Bushes, and the Rothschilds, through companies such as Rockefeller Standard Oil, IG Farben, the Union Banking Corporation, and Fritz Tyson, both of which were ran by the Harriman brothers and, of course, Prescott Bush. So they have a long history of, as I said earlier, funding the enemy through corporations, investments, organizations. This is how they do business. And there's another interesting connection with the 9/11 story, which shows how the Bush family had a company called Harken Energy. The Harken Energy had as a large shareholder Khalid bin Mahfouz. Bin Mahfouz is an associate of a guy called Mohammed al-Moody. This was another shareholder in Bush oil companies, various companies. These two, bin Mahfouz and al-Moody, were the main funders of Al-Qaeda. This is documented by the US State Department as well. How does that happen in a democracy? Another amazing coincidence. Now let's get to the meat and veg of the situation and ask, if this is all a conspiracy, who benefits? We can look at the main profiteers of the wars that preceded the events of 9/11. We can look at the main profiteers being Halliburton, which was a company run by Dick Cheney, Pennzoil, which is controlled by the Bush family, and Chevron, which was run by the Rockefellers. Unocal was also a company which profited greatly, and we'll get to them in a minute, trust me. But the last of the main profiteers was the Bechtel Company, and at the time this was ran by George Shultz, who was the advisor to the Bush family. You just can't make this stuff up. So we've gone full circle here. These are the exact people that I mentioned at the start of the video as instigating this or having something to do with this. I mentioned the names of the Rockefellers, I mentioned Cheney, I mentioned Rumsfeld, I mentioned Bush, and you can see them all interconnected, as well as people who are advisors to the Bush family, ambassadors to, or in the Bush's case, they were advisors to the Bin Laden family on behalf of the Carlyle Group. The same names can also be found when you look into a government document that was released during the early 90s, which was called the Project for the New American Century. Now, this was written as a kind of blueprint for the Bush administration to follow. Who was this document written by? Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Jeb Bush, among others. And this Project for the New American Century listed regime changes that were needed in countries that were centered around the Caspian Sea. Within this document, it stated that there was a plan to build a pipeline through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Arabian Sea. This would allow the elites of the West to control the oil and gas reserves around the Middle East. Now, the company in charge of building this pipeline was called Unocal, the ones I mentioned earlier. They were going to be in charge of the project. Unocal worked closely with Halliburton, of which the CEO was Dick Cheney. They also worked closely with Pennzoil, which was controlled by the Bushes, and they also worked closely with Chevron, controlled by the Rockefellers. So once again we see the same crop of names popping up around the same set of circumstances. It's no coincidence that these companies were the main profiteers off of 9/11 either. So anyway, Unocal were told that due to the Taliban presence in Afghanistan, they could not get a contract to build their pipeline there unless there was an international regime change. Now the interesting thing is, a short time later, Bin Laden was said to be hiding in a cave in Afghanistan. Now, is that an amazing coincidence or what? Another company that worked closely with and was involved with Unocal that was to head the pipeline project was a company called Delta Nemir. So this company was actually owned by bin Mahfouz and Mohammed al-Moudi, the same two that I just told you that funded Al-Qaeda, involved with the company who's going to be running the project to build the pipeline through Afghanistan. Nothing dodgy about that. So the Unocal and the Bushes and the Rockefellers and the Halliburtons have been told that they cannot get their little pipeline unless there's a regime change. So what happens next? In comes a guy called Zalmay Khalilzad. He was appointed by George Bush as his envoy to Afghanistan to oversee a new government in the country. The eventual new government would be headed by a guy called Hamid Karzai. Now, Karzai and Khalilzad are both, wait for it, chief advisors to Unocal. Amazing set of coincidences here today, isn't it? Absolutely mind-blowing, the connections when you actually put them together and start looking at this shit differently. And all these coincidences I've brought up today have occurred without me even mentioning the events of 9/11 itself, what happened on the day, the actual tragedy of 9/11. I haven't mentioned that. I've only touched on and exposed a few of the key characters that are all involved and how they possibly could be linked, how they could be associates, know each other, or all have a goal in mind. Now, that project for the New American Century was written out in the early 90s as the direction that America would go. And that's the direction that the country has gone since then. And that's something to think about. But anyway, that's it for today, guys. I hope I didn't offend anybody. This is not to stir up hate or to encourage conspiracy theories. This is just a video to provide a different take on information that is provided in the mainstream. It's information that may be a little bit different, maybe that you're not used to or you haven't heard before, but it does get you thinking, and hopefully I've been able to do that for you today. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes in the series where we'll be looking at other shady circumstances surrounding great crimes of the past, and we'll be exposing more amazing coincidences. Thanks for watching, guys. Keep your eye out for my upcoming video, which will cover the events of 9/11 in greater detail. Take care for now. Goodbye.